Tonight I'll read Chapter 2, Mysteries. Emily realised with relief that now she'd made the decision to head out into Wormwell, the uneasy feeling that she should be somewhere else had almost disappeared. "You noticed that he went towards whatever's scaring the fish," said Sam. Emily nodded. "Untie the linnet. I'll be back in a moment." She scooted back into her house and pulled on her walking shoes. She grabbed a warm jacket and a torch from the store cupboard under the stairs, then ran outside again, locking the door behind her. Sam had untied the linnet and was already settled on the front seat. He leaned out and held the kayak against the landing stage to steady it while Emily got in. Emily settled herself and picked up her paddle. "Ready, crew?" "Shipshape, Captain." Emily used her paddle to push the kayak away from the landing stage, and they set off, paddling with light, easy strokes that quickly settled into a familiar rhythm. At first, the Merlin was easy to follow on the quiet backwaters, as it had left a slick trail on the water, which was mostly undisturbed by other craft. Although the sun had set, the sky was bright, and the canal was a silver pathway between the dark houses. The trail led them through a couple of crossways and into increasingly large canals, and Emily soon recognised the route her father was taking. It led to the High Canal, the main waterway which ringed the centre of the town and separated the mainly residential outwaters from the more business and civic-oriented Abbey side. "Odin's eye!" Sam swore. "How are we going to find him now?" They looked out across the High Canal at the stream of boat traffic that had erased any chance of them following the Merlin's trail. They tried to spot the Merlin amongst the water taxis, barges and launches that chugged noisily along the wide waterway, their running lights bright in the evening gloom. There did seem to be fewer craft on the water than normal, however. Perhaps Sam was right about people being too scared to use their boats. The street lights were already lit and were casting yellow pools of light onto the last of the workers slowly trudging home along the stoneways that ran along either bank and tramping over the bridges that linked the two halves of the town. "I can't see it. Let's have a look down that alleyway opposite." They skimmed under the prow of a slow-moving, brightly lit water taxi, earning a blast on the horn from the irritated pilot, which Sam responded to with a cheerful wave, and shot to safety beneath the bridge on the far side, back paddling hard to bring the linnet to a stop. "What do you think, Em?" "I think this is it," she said. "Look at the watermark on the walls. A fast boat's been down here recently." There was a dark, damp stripe on both walls, nearly a foot above the waterline, where the backwash from the boat had surged up. There was little light between the high buildings, and Sam looked nervous about heading into the dark corridor. Emily had to admit to herself that she also felt a bit edgy. "There's a lamp under your seat, Sam. Fasten it to that bracket on the prow." Sam didn't need to be told twice. When he'd secured it to the bracket, he switched it on, and a powerful wide beam lit up the water and the walls ahead. They immediately felt better. They resumed paddling. The narrow alleyway twisted and turned, and the looming walls threw the splash of their paddles back at them with strange echoes that made it sound like they were surrounded by a team of ghostly kayakers. Fortunately, they soon joined a larger canal that stretched left and right, empty of other craft and bordered by high, many-storied warehouses, and left the phantom kayakers behind. The slick trail left by the Merlin led to the left, and they headed in that direction. They had left the noise of the High Canal behind. It was now so quiet that every sound they made seemed to be amplified hugely. The few small windows set into the grimy brickwork of the warehouse walls were blank and dark. Ahead of them, the canal curved out of sight, heading even further inwards. Emily shivered. When she and Sam explored the town in the kayak, they mostly stuck to the waterways on the outwaters side, and rarely ventured into the Abbey side with its large, forbidding buildings. Now they were not only deep in the Abbey side itself, but drawing ever closer to the Abbey at the very centre of the town, a place of dark rumour and late-night tales, not least because the monks within it were rarely, if ever, seen, but more so because they were supposed to worship water, or something equally strange, not Father Odin's family of gods and goddesses that Emily was familiar with. "Can you hear that?" Emily started in surprise at the sudden sound of Sam's voice, even though he'd whispered. There was a faint throbbing sound from back the way they had come. Looking back, they could see a bright light heading rapidly towards them. The throbbing grew louder and deeper, and suddenly they had to shield their eyes as the searchlight picked them out and held them as a warden's patrol boat roared up alongside, its wake causing the linnet to pitch and roll alarmingly. The patrol boat idled its engines, and several wardens came to the guardrail and looked down at them. The searchlight was almost painfully bright, and behind it the wardens were virtually in shadow. Behind them on the deck there were mounds of equipment that Emily couldn't immediately make out. One of the wardens lifted a megaphone and barked through it. "What are you children doing here at this time of night? Go home!" Beneath his abrupt tone, Emily thought there was a hint of fear. "You shouldn't be here. Clear the area immediately. There's been an incident. Turn your craft around and go home. No questions. Go!" He lowered the megaphone and waved them to turn the kayak around. Unwillingly, Emily and Sam turned the linnet until she was pointing back the way they'd come. "What's going on? What's happened?" Sam shouted. The warden with the megaphone muttered something to the warden standing next to him and raised the megaphone again. "I told you to go home." His amplified, angry voice clamoured off the walls around them. "Right now. And if you're anywhere near here when we come back, I'll have you locked up." He gestured to the warden standing in the wheelhouse, and the engines roared back into life. The patrol boat surged away, leaving Emily and Sam bobbing up and down in the choppy water. Sam stared after the departing boat. What was his problem? As soon as the wardens were out of sight, Emily dug her paddle into the water and turned the kayak around again. "Did you think he sounded scared?" "I did." Sam shrugged. "He sounded angry." "Did you see what was behind him on the deck?" "No, what was it?" "Fishing nets. Really big fishing nets." Sam's eyes widened. "They're after the beast! Told you." "I'll believe it when I see it." Sam looked anxious. "What do we do if the wardens come back? I'm not that keen on being locked up." "Keep any eye out for hiding places as we go. It's nearly dark now anyway, and as long as we switch the light off as soon as we hear them, they'll never see us." Emily sounded more confident than she felt, but her dad was out there, and she wanted to know that he was safe. Sam nodded. "Right." They turned the kayak around again and followed the slick trail of the patrol boat, keeping close to the bank where pilings and jetties would provide refuge if they needed to hide suddenly. The canal continued to curve inwards, then split into two. They took the left fork. The buildings around them began to change, the functional brick warehouses being replaced by grand, marble-clad civic buildings. The white stone glowed eerily when the light struck it. Strange echoes from up ahead began to clatter off the walls around them. Nervously, Sam leaned forward and switched the light off. Hugging the bank, they paddled the kayak cautiously towards the junction that came into view around the curve of the canal. Occasional flashes of light from the left lit up the buildings in front of them. The clamour of shouts and engines grew louder. A launch roared across the junction in front of them, searchlight pointed forwards. When it had passed, they edged up to the corner, and Sam leaned forward onto the prow of the kayak and peered around. After a moment, he beckoned Emily to paddle forwards. They slid the kayak around the corner under the lee of the wall and stopped, astonished by the chaotic scene taking place before them. There were 3 patrol boats crowding the canal and a couple of smaller speedboats circling them in a spray of white foam. All the patrol boats were shining searchlights down into the water, the beams criss-crossing the choppy surface. Just beyond the boats, a high bridge crossed the canal, lit with street lamps. Several wardens were leaning over the parapet to look into the water. One had a megaphone and was shouting terse orders to the boats below, barely audible over the revving engines and general clamour. "Ready the nets! Keep the searchlights right there! Bring the dredger in closer! On the bridge near the warden, Emily noticed 3 people standing huddled together, talking. Unlike the wardens, they didn't seem afraid, but relaxed and at ease. One of them stepped away from the others and held a spidery object out in front of him, at about waist height, and swung it gently from side to side. Hey, Em, isn't that your dad? What's he doing? Emily stared, puzzled. Looks like he's dowsing. You know, like for water. That stick thing is what he got from the house when he came home. If it's water he's after, he'll have a shock when he looks over the side of the bridge. He must be dowsing for something else, tad brain. Isn't he supposed to be journalising? That's what he said he was doing. Sam raised his eyebrows. Even from as far away as they were, they could tell that Eric was excited. He spoke to his companions and then rushed off the bridge. Holding the dowsing rod in front of him, he disappeared down a stoneway between 2 buildings. That's weird. Sam was peering at the 2 people Eric had left on the bridge. Those people your dad was with, isn't that Mrs. Harrow and Sir Harold? Mrs. Harrow from school? Sam nodded. That's the one. Didn't expect to see her before we went back on Monday. Emily scowled. Mrs. Harrow was their head teacher. She was the sort of person who paid eagle-eyed attention to important matters like what colour socks you wore and how quickly you stood up when she entered the classroom, but was completely blind to minor details like bullying. Emily's inquiring mind was also not on Mrs. Harrow's agenda. By only her 2nd year at school, Emily had been made to sit on the hard chair in the corner, just outside Mrs. Harrow's office, for more times than some of the kids in the school could count. The fact that her dad had even been talking to Mrs. Harrow, never mind talking to her enthusiastically, was a serious enough offence for Emily not to talk to her dad for a week. So H.H. is your dad's boss, isn't he? Oh, right. Emily felt guilty about thinking badly about her dad. Sir Harold owned the newspaper her dad worked for. Obviously, whatever it was that Eric was doing, it was to do with work. But then, why was Mrs. Harrow there? Emily noticed a big, casually dressed man carrying a heavy hold-all over his shoulder walk swiftly up the bridge to talk to Mrs. Harrow. They spoke briefly, and Mrs. Harrow pointed up to the top of one of the buildings overlooking the canal. The man nodded and walked quickly away in the direction of the building she'd indicated. That's odd, said Emily, but her words were cut off with a gasp as the kayak was suddenly lit up in the blinding beam of a spotlight. Emily's heart thumped at the thought they'd been spotted, but to her relief, the light flicked off them again immediately and focused on the scene under the bridge. A patrol boat roared up the canal towards them, and Emily realised with a jolt that whilst she and Sam had been watching the chaotic scene before them, the Linnet had drifted into the middle of the channel. They were now directly in the patrol boat's path. She looked around frantically for somewhere for them to hide. Quick! Over there, to the right! See? Under that arch! They paddled furiously towards it, hearts pounding, the noise of the boat behind them coming ever closer, the searchlight shining on the water just to their left. Skimming under the arch, they paddled to a stop just as the boat thundered past, its wash flooding in around them and bucking the kayak as if they were running rapids, the breakers echoing off the stonework surrounding them. Sam let out a held breath in relief. I thought they would run us over. He looked pale. I think I've had enough excitement for one night already. The choppy water began to settle, and as soon they were on calm water again. White blue light from the street lamps on the bridge made the marble around them glow faintly. They were inside a covered landing bay, with an arched roof overhead supported on marble columns either side. Wide steps led up to an ornately decorated portico fronting a marble-clad civic building. They were closer now to the circle of patrol boats. Emily could see the warden on the bridge leaning over the parapet, having a conversation with an important-looking man on the newly arrived patrol boat. Emily couldn't see the man on the boat clearly, but she thought he might be the mayor. The warden was trying to convince him about something, but he seemed unconvinced. After a couple of minutes, the Harrows went over and joined in the argument. Mrs. Harrow waving her arms and looking agitated. The man on the boat shrugged and shook his head. Finally, the warden raised the megaphone and angrily ordered the patrol boats to cut their engines. "False alarm, people! Time to wrap up and go home." "What's happening?" asked Sam, whose view was blocked by the corner of the building. "Some high-up bloke on that boat that nearly ran us over isn't impressed. I think he's calling off the search for whatever it is they think's in the water." "That's a shame." Sam didn't sound convinced. "Let's go home. There's nothing to see here. We can't follow your dad through the stoneways." But she started to argue, then sighed. He was right. Whatever story her dad was following, it wasn't out there in the canal. She hefted her paddle. "Let's get going before those patrol boats start to leave. We don't want to be caught near here." "But if it was a false alarm," said Sam musingly, "what scared all the fish?" Emily shrugged. "Maybe it was that dog in the photo." She turned to look behind her, so she could navigate the linnet out of the landing bay. She dipped her paddle into the black water and was about to start a backward stroke when, without warning, an overwhelming, choking fear swept over her like a wave of molten rock, suffocating and paralyzing her. The paddle dropped from her frozen fingers into the water. Her thoughts were flooded with terrible images of huge yellow teeth and ancient scaly skin and cold reptilian eyes, and she suddenly saw Sam and herself as small, soft, vulnerable animals floating in an eggshell on the dark water. She had a horrifying vision of something rising up through the water towards them, huge, hungry, and unstoppable. Something that saw them as prey. A blast of foul, damp breath that smelled of rotting fish and meat, mixed with the bitter odour of something long dead, filled her mouth and nose like poison. Her sight cleared, and her heart quailed as she saw that her vision was real. That's the end of chapter 2. Good night.